Good evening, everyone. I think there are a couple more people making their way up the stairs, but I will kick off, I think, because time is of the essence. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Marc Stears. I am the director of the UCL Policy Lab, and there are many exciting things about this evening, but one of them is that it is the official launch of our program of work in economic policy. We have 4 research themes at the lab. Of economic policy is one of those 4, and this begins our program of activity in that domain, and we'll hear more about that as we go forward. Before I introduce the panel and the topic and the theme and how the evening will work, a few technicalities. As I've mentioned, the bathrooms are in the basement if anyone needs them. There are no fire drills planned, so if you hear a horrible alarm, then it really is the real thing and we need to get out of the building. And there is open reception for everybody immediately following the events. We'll have conversation here, but very much hoping that you'll be able to join us for further conversation after the formal part, and that will also be in the basement, but not in the same room as the toilets. So do join us there. Well, the theme for tonight's conversation really couldn't be more important, I think, in the contemporary politics and economics of this country and many countries around the world. We have noticed 2 very different forces in our economic policy debate of late. On the one hand, I think we've seen frustration from economists and other related experts, such as think tank officials, about the way in which their expertise is not necessarily attended to as effectively as it ought to be, either by elected politicians or by the media or by sort of broader political debate. So in many of the circles that I work in universities and in think tanks, in research institutes, there's intense frustration that the sophisticated reflections, thoughts and ideas of academics haven't managed to percolate themselves into public debate and policy decision making as much as one might imagine. And of course, everybody remains haunted by the much misquoted expression of Michael Gove about the country having had enough of experts, and whether Michael ever said that or not, of course, is we can debate that over drinks, but the reality nonetheless is that expertise has felt very unwelcome in many policy-making conversations. At the same time, however, and sort of paradoxically, we're confronted, I think, in other circles by a sense that there is too much orthodoxy still in our economic policy making, and that many of the troubles that we are currently confronted by through the cost of living crisis, through escalating economic inequality, through the various strains that people feel in their everyday lives and in their communities, haven't had a bold enough response precisely because those people in the decision-making circles have been too bound by orthodox expectations. And haven't been brave enough at taking on the sort of large-scale social, economic, political reform that many people in different parts of the country or different parts of the world might be expecting our politicians to undertake. So on one hand, there's too much expertise in orthodoxy. On the other hand, there's too little expertise in orthodoxy. Clearly, both of these can't be right, or at least not in any straightforward sense. So we thought we would get experts to tell us what was really going on and what the place of expertise in orthodoxy should be in our economic decision-making. When we first conceived of this discussion, Liz Truss was Prime Minister, who is probably at one end of the spectrum in this conversation. Of course, our new Prime Minister is Rishi Sunak, who may be at another end of that conversation, but we'll see what our panelists have to say about that. So let me introduce our fantastic panel for tonight. So we have Lucy Barnes, who is from the Political Science Department in UCL, but from my perspective, even more importantly, is leading our work in the economic policy theme here at the UCL Policy Lab. Lucy is an expert in comparative politics and has spent many a year thinking about how orthodox and counter-orthodox ideas percolate themselves into the policy-making process, and knows from detailed interview work what it is that politicians think that they're doing when they either cleave to or move away from orthodox thinking. So we're extremely grateful to have you here today. We've also got Michela Tincani from the economics department, who is an expert in all kinds of aspects of economic policy making, especially in the areas of inequality, but also has direct experience of moving from academia into conversations with policymakers, not in this country but elsewhere, as I'm sure she'll tell us in her remarks. and has reflected extremely deeply upon both the opportunities and the challenges that emerge from those exchanges between experts and non-experts when it comes to this process. And obviously we have Chris Giles, the economics editor of the Financial Times. I'm absolutely thrilled that Chris is here for this conversation, in part because the idea for the debate emerged from a series of tweets that he wrote in the prime of the Liz Truss, can you say that? The prime of the Liz Truss era, and the opening up this reflection about the way in which expert ideas in economics find themselves in or outside of political debate. And as anyone who reads Chris's material regularly will know, nobody, I think, does a better job in the country at taking ideas from the most esoteric parts of the scholarly community and communicating them effectively and powerfully, not just to decision makers, but to the public more broadly. So there's no one better to launch this discussion than him. And I will have a little sort of a little bit of secrecy that I can share, which is that we have just been able to appoint Chris to an honorary professorship at UCL, and this is the first event that he'll do with that hat on as well, so we're particularly delighted by that. The way we'll proceed is I'll ask the panelists to open just with some initial reflections, initial answers, 5 minutes or so they'll speak for each. Then I might probe them a little bit about what they've said and perhaps put some challenges to each of them, and then I'll bring all of you into a conversation which, as I say, we could carry on over drinks once we've finished. On that note, Chris?
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for a lovely introduction, and also thank you very much for the appointment as an honorary professor here at the UCL Policy Lab, which I'm delighted about. The topic for tonight's talk is economics in a post-truth policy and populism. And normally when you are speaking on a topic like this as an economist, and I've got to say as the economics editor of the Financial Times, I'm not quite the high priest of orthodoxy, but I'm quite close to that. Normally we would be sort of tales of woe and, you know, battle scars of battles lost, particularly then we'd get on to Brexit and then we'd be quite depressed. But I'm going to start off with what I would say is quite a happy story, which it goes back to the Liz Truss period, just of what actually happened. When she was campaigning to be Conservative Party leader back in July, so just after Boris Johnson resigned, she went on the Today programme and said the following: we've had a consensus of the Treasury, of economists, of the Financial Times with other outlets, peddling a particular type of economic policy for 20 years. It hasn't worked. And then she went on to say what she would do differently. And I'm all in favour of lots of people having different ideas and doing things differently, but so long as it's evidence-based. And what she was criticising about the economic orthodoxy was actually much more better directed at her and her government than it was of the orthodoxy itself, because I think the orthodoxy generally isn't particularly ideological, generally relies as much as it can on knowledge and experience, and clearly doesn't get everything right. And I'm not for 1 second saying it gets everything right, but it does modify things when it gets things wrong. But the good news I was wanted to start with was it didn't work for Liz Truss, and it didn't work really rather quickly. And it hasn't worked just not only for Liz Truss in recent months, it hasn't worked for Bolsonaro in Japan, in Brazil. It's been a very difficult year for Erdogan in Turkey, and clearly the last year or so has not been easy for Donald Trump in the US. So even at a time of post-truth politics and populism, it hasn't always been those peddling those ideas that are winning in the public debate and winning and becoming more and more successful. But I do think we should ask ourselves, how has it even come to pass that we are in this situation where we're celebrating, or I'm celebrating, a victory that some people I thought had quite bad economic ideas and were pandering to populism didn't do very well. And in normal times, we now have in this country a pretty orthodox government and leading political figures. That's a pretty sensible government looking, but still they can say some very silly things. So just last week, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, through the medium of coffee cups, decided to explain inflation, and he said inflation went up because of Putin and supply chain difficulties around the world, but it was going to come down this year because government policy on nuclear power and renewables was so successful. Clearly that is nonsense and needs to be called out. And equally we have a Labour Party which is also pretty sensible, but seems to think that at the moment that all problems in the UK will be solved by VAT on private schools and a windfall tax on utility and energy companies. And of course that is nonsense as well. So we do have, I would say, some quite serious problems in terms of economic communication. And as Andy Haldane said a few years ago, there seems to be a twin deficit in the country, one of understanding and of trust in economics. I was trying to think, how would I explain? I'd agree with that. And on understanding, I think the public have genuine, but Lucy's going to be much more expert than me, but I think the public have genuine difficulty in understanding a lot of economic concepts, not for their own fault, but definitions are hard and not obvious. What GDP is, what unemployment is, the difference between real and nominal variables, just the language that we often use in economics, very, very unhelpful. People have a lot of difficulty in understanding scales. So is £1 billion a big number or a small number? Politicians and journalists are far too slow at actually pointing out, because obviously £1 billion to me is a huge number. £1 billion in the terms of the amount spent on health service in this country is actually a very small number, and so we really need to know. So scale matters. Is it big or small? Equally, levels and changes are really difficult for people to understand. So is inequality, let's say income inequality, getting worse, as lots of politicians often say? The answer, no, but it is very high, and one's a level, and we might be concerned in different reasons about both, but we need to often get that right, and people get that terribly wrong. The same as inflation, that prices are high even though inflation is going to be falling, and this is going to be an issue for the rest of this year. We have problems in aggregation and averages. So we had all of last year, we had Conservative politicians saying that we had the fastest growth rate in the G7. But clearly during 2022 we had nothing of the sort. It was because all of our growth happened in the end of 2021, and the way GDP annual averages work, don't go there, means that gets counted in the 2022, not the 2021 numbers, meant that it just didn't feel right to the public when politicians say this, and then this is when you get into the trust issue, and then we have real problems of uncertainty. So how can you say that Brexit ahead of time is a bad or a good thing? These are uncertain. How does economics, what does it know quite a lot about, like conditional statements, like compared with a friction-free border, a border with frictions is going to be worse. That is not a controversial statement in economics particularly, but what is a controversial statement is Brexit will cause X or Y damage in an unconditional sense, and that is very difficult to get across. And causality, the difference between correlation and causality. So there's a whole bunch, 6, but there's probably many more. And then these sorts of difficulties in understanding, I think, can be exploited, which means that economists often lose trust. There are bad people out there who look and understand what's not understood well and therefore exploit that. And this happens, it particularly happened in the Brexit debate, I would say, but it happens all the time. It's happening in vaccine debates at the moment, across social and hard sciences. Also, the public, we can't just exonerate them. A lot of them have motivations and look out and actually look for what I would say are conspiracies and don't necessarily want to be challenged. They want to have their priors confirmed, and so they look for that. We sometimes have a problem in we often have a problem in a lot of our media. 2 problems are clear in media. One is very biased media, which we have in this country, particularly in some of the tabloids. But we also have a problem of balance in our premier media, the BBC, and some of the broadcasters, when artificial balance gives far too much focus to certain points of view which are not then supported by the vast majority in the field. And I think in academia we have a problem of sort of a credentialism, that in the end it's what you say and how persuasive you are that really matters these days in a populist and post-truth world not who you are. So you can be Marc, who runs a very important policy lab here, but it doesn't matter. You've still got to convince people from scratch these days. So I'll just finish by saying, what do I think? So I started with a sort of a happy story saying, you know, things aren't as bad as we can sometimes fear, and when really extreme things happen, I think good ideas come to the fore, but that should happen all the time and not just in extreme times. So we can do a lot better, and I think the whole of the community, so politicians, media, academics, charities, business, all can do a lot better. And I think the most important thing is, if you were sitting there saying, I'm really cross about the way this is coming across in the public, or economics is coming across, you need to get involved. People are engaged. There's far, far too many people sitting on the sidelines in all formats, whether it's through the august pages of the Financial Times, or more recently I've had to do less than a minute Instagram videos, because for younger people, it's an outreach thing the FT is doing, and suddenly we found just very, very short videos explaining what the Bank of England does gets 500,000 views. That's far, far more than any article I ever write will get. So, so you know, there are different formats, very, very important. So you need to think about your effective techniques. Communication is really vital. There's no point in being an academic, I would say this, and I say this cautiously in academic circles, where I know that all the incentives are to spend your time writing learned articles for journals, which in the end not very many people read, but do very well in the research excellence framework. So these sorts of, we have to think hard about incentives people are given. If we want the public debate to get better, we need to be very clear that it matters. But in the end, I can say it can succeed. If you look at US academics in the economic sphere, particularly, of course, those with tenure, so they don't need to worry about climbing the greasy pole anymore, but they are very, very much out there and are contributing to the debate day in, day out, and that's something that we should do more of here. I think, I see Angie sitting in the second row there, I think science, hard science, she's a science commentator at the FT, hard science is better and has sort of some institutional structures that work, like the Science Media Centre, which helps to try and get proper to try and get proper scientific thinking out to journalists from the academic community, and I think those things can help. I also think there's not only, Trustonomics is not the only good news story out there. I think the understanding of economics through the pandemic, on average, not entirely, was excellent. So, and particularly a really rather difficult concept, that lockdowns were in the public interest and in the economic interest when we had no vaccine, but then not in the economic interest of a country when you had vaccines. And I think generally that all came across. It was difficult, lots of uncertainty came across pretty well. And I will say, just my main message is, if you are in academia, then get out there as much as possible. It's hard work, but it's also really enjoyable. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Incentives for Instagram, that's what I'm taking away there. That's brilliant. We're going to move through.
Yes, hi, so I'm Michela Tincani. I'm an associate professor of economics here at UCL. I'm actually going to build up on some of the things that Chris said, but first I wanted to introduce myself. So I'm an academic economist who is trying to get out there. I study the economics of education, and I'm very much interested in trying to translate my findings into action. So I'm interested in sharing the insights from my research with policymakers. And my research is mostly based in Chile. I've studied the Chilean education system. I've been now working with various Chilean governments for almost 8 years now. I like to believe that my ideas and my findings, even if they didn't directly shape policy, although I like to believe they did, at least my research findings got on the desks of the people who were making the decisions. And so that was quite important for me. It's interesting what Chris said, because I agree 100% that there's an issue of incentives. So my experience is that as an economist, even on your own, independently. Of course, I'm at UCL, so I represent UCL, and it's a prestigious institution, very well known. That's obviously helping me. But even on your own, you actually can have that kind of impact if you put in a lot of effort. And you don't have the incentive to put in a lot of effort. As Chris said, when you're in academia, you need to publish in academic journals. And what frustrates me a little bit is that you are in academic seminars and you hear this amazing scholarship. For example, I specialize in program evaluation, the issue of causality, the difference between correlation and causation. And you are in these seminars where you're really convinced that yes, we are getting a causal effect here. You have many, the brain power in the room is just fantastic. And then it just doesn't get outside of that room. And that's something that has always kind of frustrated me. And so I said, okay, I want to do things a little bit differently. But I didn't really have the incentive to do that. So I think in academia, we need to really put a mirror in front of ourselves and ask ourselves. So I think one issue of, you can affect policymakers if there is a willingness to listen, which is not always the case, as we've learned with the Liz Truss government recently. But there must be also the willingness to engage I talk as an academic economist, and for that one, I think that there's an issue on incentives. There's some lessons I've learned of the kind of efforts that I found worked, and those that maybe didn't work as much. I'm happy to talk about the lessons I've learned in the field, trying to do this exercise. Another thing I wanted to build up on that Chris mentioned is the issue of communication. I think we can be really horrible at talking outside of academia because we use jargon. I actually think even within academia we should start dropping jargon. But obviously jargon can help be more efficient in an academic seminar, but it doesn't work once you leave it. And you really need to get out there and talk to smart people who are not experts in your field. And that's how you learn to not use jargon and still be understood. I remember once trying to explain the difference between percentage and percentage points. And I realized I took it as granted, and then I was like, no, wait, maybe not. And so this is something that you learn by doing. And again, it's something that you're really not, you don't practice when you just stay in your ivory tower. So again, the importance of going out there and perhaps putting more incentives to go out there. Another thing to build up on the topics that Chris brought up is the topic of trust. So that one also, as an economist, is again quite difficult. If you think of theory-based economics and you make predictions based on theory, there's always uncertainty around those predictions, and that's not that easy to perhaps explain. So it's easy exposed to say, well, you got it wrong, why should I believe you? But even when we look at evidence-based, based on data, so evidence-based on data, we have big problems there too. So there's a thing called the voltage effect, where you do a small-scale experiment, you do a study, the study is internally valid, you publish it, and then you recommend a government to expand it, to scale it up, and then suddenly it doesn't work. And so that happens too. And one of the reasons why that might not work is, again, another mirror in front of academia is publishing bias. Publishing bias means that editors are more likely to publish papers that have positive results, so you're more likely to then get false positives. And then you base your policy recommendations based on false positives. What is the result of that? You lose, trust, the trust of the people. And then once you lose that, it's very hard to get that back. And again, I think that's a systemic problem within academia. If we change a publishing process, a peer review process, in a way that didn't lead to publishing bias, this issue could be mitigated. And so, bottom line, I've been thinking about, my path, and for me, it was like an individual choice. I actually think that UCL is at the forefront here because I recently got a promotion to associate, and they did take into account my policy engagement, and that's not true in many other universities. So I really think UCL is really leading here. But I also think that there are some changes within academia and within the incentives in academia that could really go a long way if we want to further evidence-based policymaking.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy Barnes, and I'm not an economist. And I imagine some of you in the room here also are not economists. So I'm going to invite you to join me in the thought experiment I did when thinking about kind of getting ready for this event. So the thought experiment is as follows. It's not a very tricky one, don't worry. No difficult trolleys or anything. Imagine that you are meeting a stranger in a bar, in a taxi, in a queue, in the queue, you know, wherever you typically meet strangers. And imagine you get to that awkward moment where they ask you, oh, so what do you do for a living? And now imagine that you have to say to them, I'm an economist. What do you expect their reaction is going to be? Is it going to be, I'm very impressed and I will now defer to your learned experience and expertise? Is it slight eyes glazing over? Is it general hostility and being kind of appalled that somebody could do that as a profession? I mean, the good news for me is that I'm a political scientist, so when I face this question, the only response I get is complete bafflement. Nobody knows anything about what we do. Nobody understands what a political scientist is. What I do as a political scientist, or what I have been doing for the past few years, is trying to understand how political actors, two important types of political actors, citizens on the one hand, and then elected MPs on the other, how they make sense of the economy, of economic policy, and to some extent of economics and economists. And as such, I wanted to just offer kind of two interventions to this conversation that we've been having so far, one on each side. So why voters mistrust, and I think it's mistrust rather than distrust, but why voters mistrust economic experts, I think does have to do to some extent with the communication problems or the communication features that have been touched upon already. But I think there's a sense in which there's a more fundamental issue there, which is that economics is still, by and large, and in its most simple and most consumable forms, for the people who don't even read the FT. Let's face it, that's a weird kind of public that you're talking to. Economics in public discourse is still generally a pretty aggregate exercise. And to the extent that diversity of lifestyles is high and or increasing, changes or levels, that aggregate number is diminishingly effective as any kind of barometer for what people are actually experiencing in their lives. And so one really good example of this was the recent debate about what the rate of inflation is. When there's diversity in consumption profiles, there is no obvious the rate of inflation. And when you say it's 2%, 4%, 6%, 9%, 7%, and that doesn't match what people experience themselves, that's going to cause that disconnect. It's going to cause that kind of lack of trust. And high or increasing economic inequality is another key element of that separation, so that national aggregate growth figures really don't resonate with people's experience at the regional, local, or personal level. And it's very hard to trust an expert who constantly tells you that black is white, up is down, it's raining when it's in fact quite sunny outside. So there is a question of jargon, there is a question of quantitative literacy for sure, but there's also an issue that communicating distributive diversity is fundamentally difficult, but that is fundamentally what economics has to be about in order to speak to the different and divergent experiences that citizens have. On the politician side, as Marc alluded to, we spent some time, it was supposed to be a nice research project where we got to travel to Berlin and to DC and to Paris and to Copenhagen. Instead, we sat on Zoom for 2 years interviewing elected representatives. And I think it is true that economic expertise is seen as narrow. But it's seen as narrow in a particular way. It's seen as narrow in the sense that it's just one expert specialization among many. It's one source of information, it's one source of evidence among many, where others could be interest groups, could be constituents' experience, could be, you know, my own personal experience as an MP, my family's experience, the background that I'm coming from. And the job, or it could be other experts in other fields, the public health experts, for example. The job of the MP, in their own perception, is to be the arbiter, not to be the deferential taker of 100% economic advice. And my challenge, actually, as a non-economist, is can we really say that that is wrong, that that more holistic view is not what we actually should expect from at least somebody in charge? I don't think it's the case that elected politicians see economics as narrow in the kind of treasury orthodoxy way. Actually, I think many elected officials do think bad economics is like that, or they think that the kind of economics that has too much influence is like that, but they all disagree on what the wrong orthodoxy is. Treasury is a popular one, but across countries it's not the only one. And actually, on the contrary, I think one of the main complaints that we have from politicians about why they struggle to make use of economic advice, and they get a lot of it, both from academics and from the civil services in Western countries are now full of economists, is that it's actually too indeterminate. And they are unable to see the areas of consensus for the areas of dissensus. Some of this has to do maybe with the kind of artificial balance that Chris referred to in terms of media coverage, where you can always find one economist to take the perverse view, and they will have some university accreditation to which is hard for a non-expert to separate out from, you know, which are the right economists. There are self-identified economists who will lend their credibility and who will lend their expertise to a very, very wide range of policy positions, some of which I'm sure would be included in the nonsense that Chris referred to earlier. I don't think that it's reasonable for us to expect politicians in general, citizens, to be able to tell who the good economists are and who the bad economists are. So that is really incumbent on the in-house process for figuring out when things may or may not be nonsense and how we do that accreditation. But at the same time, I think we should be a bit more humble, because there's a reason behind the articulation of that nonsense, and I think we need to do a better job of figuring out what that reasoning is, what the values are that that expresses, that are trying to find a logical way to come out through. And instead of saying, this is economic gobbledygook, think about, okay, well, what you're trying to do here is achieve A and B, and the way that you think you can do it, they're in a trade-off, but actually there's a constraint here which you're missing, and that's the one you need to push on if you want to achieve these two otherwise impossible things at the same time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Can we thank the panelists for their opening remarks? Before I open it to the floor for questions, let me just put one challenge back to the panel. This is a very crude question, so feel free either to dodge it or just to give a very crude answer. But in a sense, what I've heard is obviously a sort of two-part response. On the one part, the challenge or the problem lies with the public or with the politicians. They don't have the literacy or the sophistication or the nuance that they should. They're not receptive enough to the right kinds of ideas. They're not open-minded enough, etc. On the other hand, the challenge lies more within the expert economics community itself. They are unwilling to step outside the ivory tower or aren't incentivized to do so. They don't have the communications nous to do it effectively, to get beyond the gobbledygook, or possibly they're not collaborative enough with non-economists to understand that politicians are taking advice from multiple perspectives and they need to pool that. If you had to choose on balance which of those two messages you wanted to push tonight, the fault lay outside the economics community and the fault lies within the economics community. Which way are you going to go, Chris?
Second, the latter. The fault lies within the economics community, for certain. I'm pretty categoric about that. You can't, I agree with nearly 100% of what Lucy said, even though I think it was designed to be challenging. I do think the profession needs to work much, much harder about thinking about its audience, whoever the audience is, and what interests them and why. Because by engaging much better, in the end, you're going to have much better outcomes. And so the profession has got far, far too insular over the, well, as I say, it always has been. So I don't think it's got, well, this is a levels versus changes issue, which I was talking about. So I'll have to be specific about this. I think it always has been, and it's more of a problem now than it was.
Michela?
Yes, I would have to agree, although I think I have a biased view because I see them very well, the limitations of academia, because it's around me. So it's more evident for me, but I agree.
And how, in your exchanges in Chile, how open have you found the other side of the equation?
It takes a lot of work. A lot of work. You need to build a trust-based relationship. That means they need to know you, they need to see you. And when Lucy was talking about how do you tell who the good and the bad economists are, if you see this person who's consistently there, working with everyone, from the analysts to and just providing consistently consultations, evidence, data without an agenda, I think then that's how you can tell, oh, this person is, and not taking any public credit for it even. That's how you can tell, but that's a different kind of relationship. That's a relationship between the academic and the policymaker and the civil servant. It's not public, it's not, but it takes a lot of work, and they need to see how you work and they need to trust you. So years, that's the answer.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. Lucy?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't, I think I'm going to be more generous to the economists. So I don't think it's so much, the question of blame is a less interesting question to me than the question of where is the most obvious actionable change. And the public seem pretty immovable, or at least unpredictably movable. Politicians, I think, are subject to an even more Byzantine, complex, and in fact demanding set of incentives, competing incentives, than the economic academy or professional economists. And I think it's important to think about those two types of economists when we talk about these conversations, because when you talk to people who aren't academic economists, they include a much wider set of people in that definition of economists. And in fact, they see very few academic economists as the kind of standard bearers, and that has to do with media presentations as well. But the modal economist in the newspapers is a city analyst rather than an academic labor or development economist, or NHS economist. I learned the other day that NHS is the biggest recruiter of economists in the country. So, there you go. But it seems like it is on that side that there are more levers to be pulled and pushed, and so that's where we should focus, even if it's not where the fault ultimately lies.
Yeah, fantastic. One quick follow-up to that, if I may. When you were doing all your interviews with your elected officials all around the world, even if it is on Zoom, I mean, how frustrating did you find any of those engagements? Were you sitting there thinking, you're so pig-headed you can't see that you need to be more open to ideas? Or by and large, did you think that most of these elected officials would be open to new ideas if those ideas were presented in the kind of ways we've been talking about this evening?
Some of both. I think one of the things that was it was very interesting, and actually one of the things that Chris said about the kind of US academic economic influence struck a bit of a chord there. But because in the US, one of the things that was really clear was, first of all, the respect for economists was deliberately partisan. And they recognized that there are Democrat economists and there are Republican economists, and if you were a Democrat, you appreciated the views of the Democrat economists, but the Republican economists were all completely wrong-headed, and vice versa on the Republican side. In the UK, we have much less of that, but equally we have much less, I think, awareness that economics continued to evolve after about 1980. So like either you're a Keynesian or you're a Friedmanite or that's it. And then in other countries, different again. I think the French were the most impressive in terms of their ability to refer to cutting edge research work. You know, a Nobel Prize or two never does any harm in that regard. So, but they were equally, in some ways, the most narrow, because each of them would have a favored economist or two, and they'd say, oh, Piketty is fantastic, everyone else is nonsense. Or, you know, Jean Tirole is my favorite economist, but you can't trust anything that any of those Marxists are saying. So there is a sense in which they're open to ideas, but again, it's pre-selected in a way that may or may not reflect what I think any individual economist or the kind of mass of the distribution of the economist population would consider to be the mainstream. Some of the MPs that we spoke to swear blindly by what even I consider to be a quite extreme heterodox branch, but they have new ideas and they're open to, you know, academically reasoned ideas, but not the ones that are showing up in Treasury. So I think there's a balance there.
Fascinating. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Great stuff. I'm going to throw it open to questions. And I don't know if Phoebe or Lauren or someone could use this microphone. Otherwise, the people at home won't be able to hear us. Because of that, I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, if there are 3 questions in the room. And then I'll put it back to the panel. They'll choose from amongst those 3. So anyone want to join that first set of 3 questions? The gentleman in green.
Thank you. I wondered if we could talk a bit about what to me seems a conflation between descriptive economics and normative economics, because whenever I encounter the representation of economics in the media, there is no sense of a distinction between simply describing the world and assuming that the world ought to be a certain way and we need to do these things in order to get there. And I wonder whether that might partly explain why there is this degree of disquiet when people are consuming what is given to them under the heading of economics.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Anyone else want to kick us off? Yes, at the back. In the corner.
Thank you. Sometimes I wonder whether we do live in a particularly unique post-truth society, or whether we're just unhappy with the results that the system that we've been using for a long time is giving us. And so are we really talking about something that's distinct, that is really different, or are we just the losers, whoever we think we are now? And therefore the same, I don't know when the heyday was, if someone can tell me when we had a great time with democracy or politics, that would be great. And therefore maybe that would allow us to maybe be humble about some of these conversations as well. And maybe we're just very used to having, you know, a certain place in the public consciousness where we thought we would never actually have to fight for it. And now we have to actually have ideas, and we're worried that actually when we do tell the public about economics, we have to also communicate that this is not fact. It's, you know, maybe decades, sometimes days of observation, that we have to tell them that this is not based on fact, but politics is presenting as the solution. So I think sometimes the relationship between economics and politics as well is the actual issue. Politicians have to say this is what's going to solve the problem, where economics is supposed to say, well, this is not fact, this is just what we think has happened over time. So I guess there's 2 bits in there, just in terms of, are we unhappy with the outcome, and has anything actually fundamentally changed? And also maybe unpacking the relationship between politics and economics.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much. Any other reflections? First, yes, in front. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, did I miss something in the back?
Hi, I think a big challenge which we're going to have going forwards is that the likes of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, supported by Patrick Minford during the Brexit campaign, I mean, it's been very, very successful for them, and they've been very, very amply rewarded for their post-truth populist economic nonsense. And yeah, I mean, I think when other populist politicians see see the success which they've had and the rewards which they've generated for themselves, I think that's going to be quite a big temptation to continue with these economic distortions to win the next argument, whatever that may be.
Yeah, great, lovely. Thank you very much. Fabulous. I'll come back to the second round if that's okay. Thank you. So three big questions there: the distinction between descriptive and normative economics, a question about whether things have in fact ever been any better, and whether this tangled relationship between politics and economics is always going to throw up the sorts of challenges we've been talking about. And then a question about whether the sort of post-truthers have success on their side. And certainly anecdotally that was a widespread fear, I think, in those early Trust days, that this was a tactic which was going to go well for her, and perhaps it didn't go well for her, but might for the next lot. I don't mind where you roam amongst those, so don't feel as if you have to answer them all, but Michela, do you want to kick us off?
I actually want to talk about the post-truth Johnson and Gove, that they reap their benefit. I saw a paper that was, the working paper came out like a couple of weeks ago. There's a role that fact-checking can play. Let me tell you what this paper found. This is a paper that was done in Italy with a sample of Italian members of parliament. And the researchers, they randomly fact-checked. So they collected data on a few months of statements, and then they randomly fact-checked half of them, and the other half they didn't. So this way, this allows them to get the causal effect of fact-checking. And what they found is that those who were fact-checked, after being fact-checked, they were less likely to say statements that were verifiably false. So you might think, actually, that's good. Maybe there is a role for fact-checking. The other side of the medal is that they were also less likely to say anything verifiable at all. So they were more likely to use vague, ambiguous language. So I think that means it's even more important for people like us to try to push the truth, the data, the evidence there. But perhaps there is some role for fact-checking.
Fabulous. Lucy?
Yeah, a couple of things. So first, on the final point, where I think the kind of cutting edge of political science research here is actually a little bit, paints a little bit of a different picture than the one where the kind of populists are really opposed to the technocrats. Because in fact, there's a kind of common underpinning in public attitudes and a certain kind of perception and of evaluation, which drives support for both of those poles at the same time, which seems a little contradictory. But it is a distaste for actual political contestation, and in particular, adversarial bickering, so that perception of partisan competition over policy issues leads people both to think, God, all these elites are evil and we need a true return to the people who know, salt of the earth, that kind of populist message. But it also drives people in a direction where they're like, can't we just put some experts in charge who can sort this out? And so while there's a little bit of a tension between populism and technocracy, there's also a kind of a complementarity there where you're taking things out of the sphere of political competition. I think this speaks to this question about the tying of politics and economics at the back, because really I kind of agree. I think that to some extent the erosion of deference is a great thing. And some of the people who were the experts before are going to be the losers there, and many of them, we're up here on the stage. So some of it is like our feelings are a bit hurt, and people don't listen to us and think that we're the best thing since sliced bread quite as much as they used to. We have to kind of compete in the marketplace of ideas without that inbuilt advantage. And I think that that's exactly right. But I also think that we have not been developing the right tools for it. Although I haven't seen Chris on Instagram, so maybe I'm going to be, going to be corrected there. The playing field maybe should be level. It historically hasn't been. And incorporating certainly a greater diversity of voices into that universe of what is considered expertise, I think is a really positive move. But there are definitely kind of growing pains associated with it because it's difficult to pass out the noise from the signal. And on average, maybe the right ideas do percolate up, but I don't think, and maybe I'm just slightly more pessimistic than Chris, I think we're just going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. And Liz Truss made a couple, and then they were corrected. And I think that may be the best equilibrium we can hope for.
Great democratic voice, Chris.
I'll take all three questions in order. So the conflation between descriptive and normative statements by economists. Well, let me just translate that into something I think people understand better, which is when economists describe how the world works and how to make it a better place. They're much more successful at the first, how the world works. They're pretty good, I think, in being able to describe trade-offs and say they exist. It's much, much harder to talk about how to make the world a better place because an economist's skills are not necessarily well placed to do that when those questions, not necessarily in the educational sphere where there might be some good evidence about how to just improve things for everybody, but often it's trade-offs between different groups in societies. And as Lucy said, what's good for one person to make the world a better place for one person might be bad for someone else. And their economics is very bad and should be bad because that's a political process to make these sorts of choices. We don't have any expertise in making those choices between different groups, and we shouldn't think that we do because ultimately that has to be, in a democracy at least, has to be decided democratically. To the question at the back, I absolutely agree with you that in lots of ways it might not be, a lot of it's not about post-truth or populism. We are unhappy because our economic circumstances in this country are much worse, much, much worse than we thought they would be in 2007 before the global financial crisis. So we have had a particular disappointment in the opportunities, economic opportunities available to the whole country, and have been dealing with that now for 15 years. And looks like we're going to be dealing with it for longer because we've had additional crises piled on top of the pandemic and the energy crisis, which both have certain permanent effects or persistent effects, which the global financial crisis had huge ones. And while that continues, and while the disappointment continues, we can expect people to be unhappy, and that isn't. There's nothing to do with really economics or politics. I think it's just it's a completely understandable reaction of people in society that if they had expectations that a certain standard of living was possible in the future, and they were living their lives along those lines, they maybe never thought about it in those terms, but they just thought where the future lay for them and their family and their children, and then it's much worse. They will naturally think who's to blame because it can't be just bad luck for everybody. So it's a very natural thing for people to think someone else has gained and I'm the loser, but we all are, I think, and that makes life difficult for us all. And in terms of, I don't think Boris Johnson, I think I have to disagree. I don't think he has been amply rewarded. He might get a load of cash, but is he happy? And I think he would be much happier being, the whole operation Save Big Dog. He wanted to be saved. He didn't want to be kicked out. And so I think he's ultimately unhappy, as is Liz Truss at the moment.
Fantastic. We're coming very close to the end, but if there are lightning fast final questions, then I'll ask for lightning fast responses. There was one over there which we missed in the first round, and then there's one here.
So we've talked about what economics can do to get its side of the story out, but what do you think the role of the media is? Should the media do more and be different in its approach in terms of portraying economics and economic specialists? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hello, I'm very fortunate to be a colleague of Chris at the FT, and I wanted to say that you could substitute science for every time you said the word economics, and we've been having exactly the same conversation. And as well as my science writing work, I'm also a trustee at Sense About Science, and we've been trying to work out what how we get better policy, scientific policy, into government, and we've been working with the Cabinet Office and so on. So I urge you to perhaps make those conversations. But my very quick question is, Chris and the others, you talked about trustonomics, but as I understand it, if you listen to interviews with Liz Truss subsequently and Kwasi Kwarteng, their point of view seems to be that actually their ideas weren't tried hard enough, or they need to be tried differently, stronger. So there is a sense that they're still pushing back, even with the evidence of that sort of almost crashing the economy. That they're still pursuing this idea that the orthodoxy is wrong. So I just wanted to sort of your take on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Let's put those two to the panel. The role of the media and what you do about people who think that they're right, even in the face of everything which tells them that they're not. Lucy, we'll start with you. We'll come this way.
I think the role of the media is really important in ways that we don't understand as well as we should. I think there's been a big disconnect between kind of communication studies and politics, where I sit, and my only real answer as an academic is fix that. And then what do you do about the people who just think that their ideas weren't tried hard enough? Or just don't vote for them.
So I won't comment about the role of the media because that's not my expertise. Regarding the second question, I just think, ideology, and they were pushed out of office. They're out of office now, so I wouldn't listen to them now.
Well, I obviously have to take the media question. I think our role is both to describe economic policy as it happens, to describe the debate around economic policy. I think we need to recognise it's often done very badly in lots of parts of the media, and I think it can be done badly for two ways. One is the sort of false equivalence, sort of BBC type of real bad error that can be made, where you find one person on one view, another person on another view, and you don't give viewers or listeners or readers a sense of where the actual debate and the centre of gravity of opinion is. That is a real problem. It's been a problem in science as well, but science has got rather better at that with the BBC, and so you don't get climate deniers on the BBC anymore. Well, not you do a bit, but a lot less than you. There's a lot less of that going on. But I think there's another role of the media which I think is important, and I try and do a lot, which is also to challenge policymakers. And actually poke them and prod them, because they don't like it, but it's really important to do that. And there you've got to, it is the sort of role of the media about speaking truth unto power, which is the same as officials and civil servants have, but that is an important role, and people can do it in different ways, and you can also get really quite motivated people doing it. So it can be done very badly and can be done well, but I do think that is a role that we have, and you shouldn't become cosy friends of the governor of the Bank of England or the chancellor or the head of the Treasury. You should be on very good terms with them, but they should be a little bit wary that you might turn and ask them a very nasty question in public, because that is your role as well. And in terms of where Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng got to, I think, so they say that they not quite, I don't think I agree that they say they wasn't tried hard enough. They say that they maybe got a bit over enthusiastic and it was all right, but maybe they should have it was the implementation of the policy rather than the policies themselves. And so to conflate that with the previous question, I think the media has quite an important job of recognising that they're not important people anymore, and not giving them a status above where they are. And we shouldn't, just because they open their mouths and say this is still right, we should keep reminding them of the mistakes that made. And the difficulty was just being not even a representative, but being British in an international forum in that period in September and October. And I certainly was there on the evening Kwasi Kwarteng had to resign. I was in Washington just before he flew back to the UK, and the only conversation at the British Embassy that night, of a large number of British people were there, was how bad Britain looked on the global stage because of what was happening to our politics, and how everyone was either being pitied or was having to apologise for their own country, which was not a comfortable position for any of us.
Thank you so much. Well, we're coming to the close of the formal business. I mean, that reflection is clearly right, I think, about the experience in that Trust Kwarteng moment. The flip side, I think, is a slightly more optimistic story, which is, I've been in Australia for 5 years running the Policy Lab at the University of Sydney, and so I returned to the country about 7-8 months ago. And we launched the UCL Policy Lab in the end of May last year. And what has struck me about British policy making, British economic policy debate in that period is just an extraordinary openness from all kinds of people, top civil servants, elected officials, senior journalists, think tanks and commentators, really eager for new ideas and exchange of debate, and also for a diversity of opinion and perspective. So largely those people don't just want to be in the room with a particular viewpoint or a particular group of experts. They want to be in a room full of people with diverse experiences, diverse views, strong evidence and strong arguments. And that's what we at the lab try to provide, is an opportunity for people to come together, share ideas and reflect, but also then to pass those ideas on to those who are either at the moment governing us or who may govern us in the not so distant future. So there is a wonderful debate here. We're privileged to be in London, where I think it is ongoing all the time. We're privileged to be at UCL, which encourages it and supports it in all kinds of ways. But most importantly, we're privileged to have people like you join us and have those arguments and those conversations. I hope very much that you'll keep coming to the UCL Policy Lab, both in this theme of economic policy, but in our other themes too. To drop us an email if you aren't on our lists at the moment and want to be. Also, please, of course, join us for some drinks downstairs to carry this conversation on. But before all that, let's again say thank you to each other and to the panel for an extremely stimulating evening. Thank you very much. Drinks downstairs.